Gather round cause it's story time. Let's imagine they use our mind. Cause it's story time, story time. It's story time, story time. Let's use our imagination. Think it and then create it. It's story time, story time. It's story time, story time. Let's explore with imagination. Think it, exaggerate it. It's story time, cause it's story time, story time. Frank, the Fart Fairy. Written by Franklin P. Hardy. Illustrated by Laura Ade. Read by Jamil. Fairies were one of three magical creatures that never farted. Mermaids were another who never broke wind. They didn't have bottoms, so they couldn't. And Yetis were too embarrassed to bottom burp, or even normal burp. Gnomes, on the other hand, couldn't stop farting, and were second on the fartometer of fartiness to one other creature. Humans. And with most things that humans lost, hid, and left behind, the fairies were on the case. Well, one fairy was. His name was Frank, the Fart Fairy. It was Frank's job to stop all the gassy bottom pops, all those silent stinkers that whipped it across the room, the mini bubble and squeaks that turned baths into jacuzzis, and he was even there on those rare occasions when mom let one rip. However, Farts Frank Trap didn't always stay trapped for long. That's because, as well as finding farts hilarious, Frank also used them to prank. He loved to bubble prank the mermaids at Sunset Lagoon, stink bomb the flower fairies in the Rainbow Meadow, and let off fart explosions on Mount Yeti. Avalanche! However, one day Frank went one fart prank too far. The agenda for today's meeting is this year's FairyCon, and it backfired. The fairies, the mermaids, the yetis, and even the gnomes had enough of Frank's farty antics. Farts are not funny, lectured Fairy Godmother. Neither are pranks, wisecracks, or jokes about farts. Butts are also not funny. You're banned from Fairyland. And Sunset Lagoon. And Mount Yeti. You can still come to Gnome Pond if you want. Frank couldn't believe it. He was going to miss his favorite #1 event in the fairy calendar, FairyCon, where fairies could show off their talents and maybe get an autograph or two. It's not very fair, moaned Frank. My farts are funny, my pranks are hilarious, and my jokes about farts are hysterical. I'll show them. Even though Frank was in a lot of trouble, he decided the best thing to do was to plan the ultimate fart prank. And where better to play the prank than at FairyCon? Frank set to work, vacuuming the most fierce farts, the most bubbly bottom burps, and the stinkiest stink bombs. Then he trapped each fart in a mini cushion. I think I will call my new invention a farty pillow. Soon the big day arrived. Frank disguised himself as a superhero fairy and crept into the bustling fairycon. He went from chair to chair, sofa to sofa, from fairy toilet to fairy toilet. Yes, there's a such thing, and hid hundreds of farty-filled pillows. What happened next became known in fairy folklore as the epic Farty Works display. It started with a gnome, bark, then a couple of fairies, bark, then a tooth fairy, burp. Suddenly, the whole of FairyCon was filled with the sounds and smells of hundreds of farty pillows being sat on. But that wasn't what made Fairy Godmother turn purple with anger. It was what happened next. For the first time in fairy history, a fairy farted for real. The sound of the farty pillows caused a gassy chain reaction. The fairies couldn't help it. One after another, they broke wind, let it rip, and squeaked one out. But unlike gross human farts, fairy farts sounded like melodic harps, smelled of real raspberries, and were made of magic. And all the magical fairy farts exploded in a cascade of glorious glitter that fell all over Frank. As the fairy farts settled, everyone peeked out from where they were hiding, and there in the spot where Frank was last seen was a large ginger-haired farty pillow that looked a lot like a prank-loving fart fairy. Everyone started to laugh, even Fairy Godmother. Frank didn't understand. Why is everyone laughing at me? Frank turned and saw himself on a large FairyCon TV screen. I've turned into a giant farty pillow. That's enough fun for one FairyCon, said Fairy Godmother. And with a wish of her wand, Frank was back to normal. I'm sorry, said Frank. Frank, all farts are always funny, said Fairy Godmother. Some jokes are sometimes funny, and a prank is only funny if it's not played on you. Frank learned a very important lesson, and from that day on, he vowed never to prank a fairy, a mermaid, a yeti, or a gnome ever again. Instead, he set up his own farty pillow factory so everyone else could prank each other. Frank later changed the name to Whoopee Cushion. For some reason, the name Farty Pillows didn't catch on. The end. Thank you for reading with me. Gather around cause it's story time. Let's imagine they use our mind. Cause it's story time, story time. It's story time, story time. Let's use our imagination. Think it and then create it. It's story time, story time. It's story time, story time. Let's explore with imagination. Think it, exaggerate it. It's story time, cause it's story time, story time.